Welcome to Speak Your Mind by Climobilize. My guest for this session is Professor Steve Keen. Steve has been a critic of neoclassical economics for over half a century. He's the author of Debunking Economics and is about to publish Rebuilding Economics from the Top Down. In a recent report on Carbon Tracker, he described the economics of climate change research by William Nordhaus and his colleagues as the worst research I have ever read. Steve, it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you.
In this session, Steve will be speaking about why has declaring climate emergencies mostly failed to create meaningful change. So let's begin right there. Steve, why are climate emergencies failing to create meaningful change?
The major factor is that people don't think there is a climate emergency. And the reason they don't think it fundamentally comes out of two main sources. Fossil fuel companies who are trying as hard as possible to hang on to their business model, which involves digging fossil fuels out of the ground and selling them. But also aided and abetted, this is the most unfortunate point, by people that are unfortunately very much trusted in our society, and that's economists. And a similar dynamic is applied with economists as well. They're not digging up stuff out of the ground and flogging it, but they argue that flogging stuff is the basis of human civilization. And for the free market, absence of control, you do what you want, innovation, entrepreneurship, et cetera, they champion all those forms of activity. And so to be told that you are reaching the limits of what the biosphere can manage, and if you go beyond these limits, then capitalism can't continue, that is a red rag to a bull to those people. And they do their best to argue that that's not the case. And they've come up with arguments which make it look like what greenies call a climate emergency is no big deal. And therefore, there's really nothing we should bother doing. Minor twinkling around the edges, cost-benefit analysis, that's all that matters. And really that's come out of all the policy meetings for the last 30 or 40 years has been minimal stuff saying we don't want to do too much in case we waste money trying to address what is a minor problem. And that's why it's failed. The powers that be, the people making the decisions, the people advising them, largely don't think the climate isn't an emergency.
Right. So I know that William Nordhaus frustrates you. And what is it about that faulty research that is so dangerous?
Well, I'll give you what I thought would be the case when I started looking at it. As you mentioned in the introduction, I've been a critic of mainstream economics for half a century. So I'm used to seeing research that looks superficially good, and you take a deep look at it, and it's just ridiculous. So, for example, the theory of finance, which most people learn and practice if they work as finance professionals, is based on the assumption that we can predict the future. They don't put it that way, but that's what it amounts to. So to be able to critique it, you've got to go and say, well, this particular assumption implies, et cetera, and it's a hard slog. And when I looked at the climate work, I thought I'd need to explain why using a Ramsey growth model is the wrong framework. Instead, what I found was, and this is the part that I find just so horrifying, economists like William Nordhaus made up their own numbers about climate change and fitted their models to the numbers they made up. When the way they made up the numbers, and I use made up quite advisedly because that involves, the sort of thing kids do when they're playing games. That's the level of sophistication here. So in his first paper in 1991, where he gave an empirical estimate of the damages to GDP from climate change, he said that you can divide an industry into three sectors: very exposed to climate change, moderately exposed, and negligibly exposed. And he then said that 87% of the American economy is negligibly exposed to climate change. It included all of manufacturing, all of retail and wholesale services, the finance sector, government, and a few other divisions, including, and I love this bit, mining. And then obviously somebody later to him said, well, there's underground mining, William, but there's also open cut. And so he later book, he said, underground mining. And what he's basically saying is anything done undercover is not exposed to climate change. And that is so juvenile that it took me quite a while to realize that he actually effectively believes this. He's fundamentally equating being exposed to climate to being exposed to the weather. So put up an umbrella and you're safe. It was so juvenile that if the sort of stuff that if I had a young child going off to school giving answers like that to a question from their kindergarten teacher, I wouldn't let them leave home until they'd amended their answers. So it is really completely juvenile ideas that have developed the numbers to which they've fitted their models. And so the first assumption was that a roof will protect you from climate change, what he calls carefully controlled environments. Second is you can use the temperature and GDP relationships we find today across space. So variations like in America, Nebraska's gross state product versus Florida's, there's a 10-degree temperature difference between the two, a $20,000 difference in income, which is only tangentially due to temperature differences. They then think that data they can use to predict what's going to happen in the future. So 10 degrees of climate change, no big deal. It's only the difference between Nebraska and Florida, and there's only a small amount of income difference. Who cares? I wish I was joking, but this is the sort of stuff I'm reading. And another paper that that's from 2017, which I saw Nordhaus used to justify his assumptions, just in his most recent paper. That one says that 8 degrees of warming will reduce GDP by about 15%. And what they mean is 15% compared to what it would be in the absence of climate change. So that 15% reduction 80 years in the future translates as a fall in the annual rate of economic growth of about 0.2 or 0.3%. And that's one of the most extreme predictions they've made. So they've made up their own numbers. Their own numbers bear no relation to what we face. And they have therefore fooled us into believing that what is actually an existential threat is no big deal.
So that begs the question, how does this research get into the mainstream? I mean, aren't there people who are supposed to oversee this and keep it nonsense out of the literature?
This is where people have been fooled by the process of refereeing. And the process of refereeing means you give an article to your peers and your peers evaluate whether they think it's sound or not. And that's okay so long as your peers are actually experts in the area you're commenting upon. And now academics work in intellectual silos. So people working in physics normally don't read economics, economists don't read psychology, et cetera, et cetera. So the people who referee these papers are also economists. And they have no understanding of the climate, virtually none. Okay? So people who don't understand the climate were reviewing papers by written people who also don't understand the climate, but use the basic tools that mainstream economists use. So what they were looking for, are they using the tools correctly? Not do these empirical assumptions make sense, because they are not in a position to be able to judge it. So because this falls between two silos, it's climate science and it's economics. The empirical assumptions should have been assessed by climate scientists, and no climate scientist I can think of would have allowed any of these papers to be published. There's only a tiny number. There's only 39 papers, as it happens, that have set an estimate for the damages to GDP from climate change. I've read the whole lot. Speaking as somebody who works with climate scientists and speaking of some of their reactions when I've shown these papers, not one of them would have been published. So it's a failure of interdisciplinary research that this stuff was ever published. And then what's happened is it's developed momentum of its own. So those 39 papers are now used by a couple of thousand other economists who develop what they call the social cost of carbon. And it's a little, sort of factory pumping out this material, little cottage industry. 2000 is about maybe 2% of the global number of economists. That's only a tiny level of involvement by economists overall. Most of them don't think climate matters anyway. They're happy to see these numbers come out. They think serious work is being done. What is happening is stuff that should have been filtered by climate scientists and would never have been published if it was, has become its own little industry. That's what politicians read. That's what their advisors read. That's what journalists read. They have no idea of the scale of damage coming our way, which climate scientists are trying to tell them. But what they hear is not the climate scientists locking them to the gates of Shell and things of that nature. They're reading 10% damage to GDP in 2100. And they think, well, that's somebody else's problem. I can forget about it, leave it till later. Therefore, we're doing nothing.
We should digest that for a moment. Um, and I mean, you've already touched upon it, but I believe politicians read these reports and they know exactly where the science lies, and yet it's not reflected in policy. They're using more of the less accredited numbers. And maybe you can comment on why policy is so disconnected from the
For a
science.
start, politicians do not read these papers. I mean, I haven't read the entire IPCC document. The latest IPCC report from 2022 was something like 3,500 pages. There are 3 volumes of it. It's overwhelming volume. What they will do is they will tell one of their advisors to go and read the economic section. Now, the economic section, as it happens from the 2022 report, is chapter 16 of Working Group 2. It's about 80 pages. And in that, the punchline for that particular section is a statement saying that if 4 degrees of warming by 2100 will reduce global GDP by between 10 and 23% compared to what it would have been in the complete absence of climate change. That's what the policymaker would report back to the politician behind closed doors would say, that's somebody else's problem. Let's say it's trivial, and B, it's in 80 years' time. What do I have to do to say to the media, look like I take it seriously while doing bugger all at the same time? So they're not aware of the problem. And people think the IPC is an integrative process. No, it's not. It's just like academia. The chemists write the chemical chapter, the physicists write the physics chapter, the meteorologists write the meteorology chapter, and so on. They don't get together and compare the whole thing. So this stuff is published, as I said, it's chapter 16, page 65. You'll find that statement. Now, I know most scientists haven't read that, let alone most policymakers. So the trouble is, the only thing they're listening to is the economists. The economists don't know what they're talking about. That becomes what politicians and journalists and finance people think is the real world. And that's why we have no idea in the policy level of what the hell we're facing.
Um, well, what's the solution?
Well, one of the solutions is to kick economists out of the whole process. And I'm working with a couple of climate scientists to try to manage that. First of all, by producing something for the economists have done for themselves to do a science version instead. So what economists have done is produce what they call damage functions, and they'll multiply a figure for GDP without global warming with this damage function to say what it's going to be in the case of global warming. And the damage functions they use almost universally simply say damages are going to be equal to small constant multiplied by the temperature change squared. Now, in the case of William Nordhaus, his most recent version of his paper, 2023, I think he says something like about that the coefficient is 0.3%. So a 1 degree increase in temperature will reduce GDP by 0.3%. A 2 degrees will be 4 times that, which is 1.2. 3 will be 9 times, et cetera, and you get a very small number out of that. Even if you get up to, like, you need 10 degrees warming, you get 100 times 0.3 and you get 30% damages to GDP. Now, he's not using those numbers, but I know one of the paper he quotes uses 8 degrees of warming by 2100 and said it'll be a cause of 16% fall in GDP compared to what it would be in the absence of climate change. And that converts into a decline in the annual rate of growth for the next 80 years of about 0.35%. Still positive growth towards 8 degrees of warming. Now, you look at the science literature, which I read extensively as well, and one of the most influential papers there by Zhu and Ramanathan in 2017 said 1.5 degrees is dangerous, 3 degrees is catastrophic, and 5 degrees is existential. Now, the economists are saying 8 degrees will cause a 0.35% fall in the rate of economic growth. There's an enormous divide between what the scientists are trying to tell everybody is coming, what the economists are bullshitting themselves and the rest of the world about. What our policy is based on the bullshit of economists and not the actual understanding of climate scientists.
So I have 2 questions left. One of them is my stock portfolio going to give me a nice retirement like I'm planning?
It depends. What have you got in there? Rocks, bows and arrows?
You
I'd recommend them. I mean, frankly, the the level to which economists have understated the dangers has been absorbed by the finance sector. So consulting firms like Mercer's, for example, and a whole range of other consulting firms have been reading these reports and then telling pension funds, this is what's going to happen to your portfolio. And for example, my own superannuation firm, I'm Australian and we have what we call superannuation rather than 401ks, is the Uni Super from Australia. Their most recent report from 2022, pardon me, has told me that a 4.3 degree increase in global temperatures by 2100 is, and I quote, an acceptable risk to your portfolio. Now, according to climate scientists, 4.3 degrees of warming is beyond catastrophic. The question will be whether humans actually survive. That's the gap between what people are being told in finance and what's actually going to happen. So you can forget your pension funds, you can forget the returns, they're not going to happen. You're going to, if we let these temperature rises come through, and they are in the pipeline, if you look at Jim Hanson's most recent work, we are, not immediately, obviously, but we're on a trajectory towards 10 degrees of warming. That's going to mean the only surviving creatures on the planet are likely to be insects and reptiles. So we are treating this as a cost-benefit optimization problem when it is an existential threat. And that's why we are fooling ourselves to believe we're going to have a financial future. We're going to be lucky to have a future at all, let alone a financially viable one.
And this is a topic we're going to come back to in future events because it's a fascinating topic that people are not paying attention to. So as we come to the end, I'd just like to ask you, are there any final thoughts or takeaway messages that you'd like to share?
The only thing is to read the climate science literature. A lot of it's accessible, and use that and hammer your politicians about it, because the politicians, because they have this huge buffer of advisors who read the material that they don't actually read and make the decisions, they're nowhere near exposed to the actual literature. So I'd suggest read a particular paper, Zhu and Ramanathan, that'll be a good start. Read anything by Tim Lenton, who talks about tipping points, and then start quoting that in meetings to politicians, and at least disturb them to make them realize there's something different between what the scientists are saying and what their advisors are telling them, groups like the IPCC are publishing. There's really nothing individuals can do on any grand scale to be able to insulate themselves while the rest goes down in a heap. This is going to have to be collective action, and the major obstructions we have to taking sensible action right now are politicians who are taking the advice of economists seriously.
Well, it's a rosy picture, but we've reached the end. I want to thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your time. It's a story that needs to be told. Someone has to tell it, someone brave, like yourself. I want to wish you the best of luck in 2024 and good health, and as we take on this fight together.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Okay, all right, done.